Well, good morning, church. Thank you for continuing our deep dive. Today we're in Acts chapter 15, verses 30 through 35. We're kind of finishing up now Paul and Barnabas, who took this message to Antioch to again address as Gentiles. Do they have to become Jews in order to become Christians? They're now going back to Antioch. They're sharing the letter, and there's great excitement as those there who are Christians, who were Jews, and those who weren't are excited to see that how now the gospel will be able to more easily spread as they understand. And there's an agreement that you don't have to become a Jew to become a Christian. See, if we go back and look at the council, they really were brave and they were listening to God. I think I get two things from the council and what they brought forward. First, they were willing to listen to God's leading. See, they didn't understand in history where they were. But before Christ, his death, burial, and resurrection, there was an old covenant, one in which they obeyed the laws of Moses. One that God had given thousands of years earlier. But once Christ came, they entered into a new covenant. And guess what? This new covenant was going to have new scriptures. They were living it now, but these writings and Acts would be shared with others. And then Paul's writings and what we now have as the New Testament would be there. And they realized that God was speaking to them differently. That when God allowed Peter or told Peter to go to Cornelius and share the gospel, that he didn't tell him to make them Jews first, but share the gospel. And so when they made this decision, they really were opening to the leading and guidance of God. The second thing I see is that they were really brave because they were in an echo chamber in Jerusalem. They were Jews, and all pretty much the Christians that were there were Christian Jews. They were Christians, but they're still practicing the Jewish rite that were there. They were still doing the dietary law. They were still doing all the feasts, the different things that were happening. And it would have been so easy in that culture to say, who cares about these Christians that are way out there? No, we're not going to change. I mean, Jesus was a Jew. He practiced dietary law. He was circumcised. So why wouldn't we expect them to do that? And that would have been the decision that would have been the most popular in Jerusalem. And yet they looked at it and really saw, no, this isn't true. That this gospel is now different. They kind of recognized that things had changed. And when they stood up and said, you don't have to be a Jew to be a Christian, it really opened the gospel to go around the world. And I think from this, we really understand the principle of what's called contextualization. And that is that when it comes to sharing the gospel, the essence of the gospel never changes, but there is a contextualization that is proper to change. In other words, we have to be careful to make sure the gospel, the good news, doesn't get tied in the culture that's bringing it. See, we see this in the great missionary Hudson Taylor. Remember when he went to China as a missionary? At that point, you won people to Christ as Chinese, and then you basically made them Westerners. They worship in a Western style. They were supposed to wear Western clothes, even eat Western food. So they tied the gospel to the Western culture, which it shouldn't be. And Hudson Taylor knew that, so he made a radical change. You know, he dressed like a Chinese. He ate the food of a Chinese. He said they could become Christians and not stop being Chinese. And believe me, in his day, he was not liked by the other Westerners, by the other mission organizations. It took a while until we realized that we reach people for the gospel by not pulling them into our culture, but going into their culture and delivering the gospel there. I always say it's kind of like a gas can. If you look at a gas can from the 1960s, it's metal, it's heavy, it's red. But it's different from the gas can we have today that's made of plastic. And again, it's red, but much lighter, easier to function with. And that's the gas can we have. Though the essence of both those gas cans was the same thing, to carry gasoline. So we changed the way we did it because it was a more effective way of doing it. And we have to be careful, even as Christians today, that we don't somehow tie our Christianity and how we present it to the culture we live in. I mean, it wasn't very much back. When we go back to the 70s and 80s, and man, worship wars were the big thing. Churches were splitting because as music was going and having guitars and drums, and some churches were bringing them in, and churches were saying, you can't do that. You can't have rock Christian music, or you can't have these things. There were churches that split over it. Churches that split over how you were supposed to dress when you came to church, or different things that were there. And it took a while, and I wouldn't say worship wars are over, but for the most part, they are now. And we now look at it and say, hey, wait a minute, you can be a Christian and not be like everyone else, exactly the same culturally. And as we go forward, we want to hold the essence of what's true. The gospel does not change. Christ came and died for us. We are sinners, separated from God. The only way to God is through Christ. but how we present that and other things we add to it, we have to be very careful to allow the contextualization of the gospel so it's more effective in reaching people who don't know Christ. And what they did here in the first century obviously was amazing. I don't think we'd be standing as believers if they hadn't followed God's leading in that time. And we need to make sure that we don't create walls that push people away from Christ. As a matter of fact, the only thing that should offend someone is that I'm a sinner and that the only way I come to Christ is through Jesus. Guys, we have a great hope, a great message. It doesn't stop. We're still to take this message around the world, and we will continue to do that. Hey, I'm so glad you're in this deep dive. They're about to start the second missionary journey that's going to be controversial but exciting. You're going to see the gospel continue to spread around the world, and I think you'll enjoy it as you continue each day in our deep dive.